Welcome to session 3 of our national curriculum class, level 2. We want to talk about scrolls today, not just make the scrolls for the grill, but get a little background on what a scroll is and how you draw a scroll and the history of scrolls and the whole world of scrolls. And then we go into the different types. In between, Russ will show how to make an important tool, a scrolling fork. And then we get to more scrolls and all along some tips and tricks. And as always, you can ask questions, put them in the chat line if it is while somebody is presenting, and then we will have slots where we can talk about things. Scrolls are inspired by nature. There's many examples of scrolls in nature, like these ferns that I found this spring right behind my house. And then there's all kinds of animal life that has scroll form, like mollusks, and you find scrolls everywhere in nature. Blacksmiths used different kinds of scrolls. They created different kinds of scrolls, but they all follow kind of the same rules, geometric rules. They start with a blob or something in the middle, or a leaf, and then they spiral outwards. And that's why they're also called spirals. Nature uses spirals that open up continuously. So the scroll gets wider and wider as it goes from the middle to the outside. And they come, or mathematicians call these logarithmic. That basically means they open up. I mean, if I want to go in detail, then it's getting very technical. There's more to it, but this is all we need to know. They open up. They're not constant distance between the different rings here. They get wider and wider. Often you read about the golden spiral or Fibonacci spiral. That is one of the various pitches that is possible, and it's related to the golden mean. This drawing is commonly seen too, how to create a golden spiral. It's based on the Fibonacci series of numbers. You start with 2 ones, and then you add those, you get to 2, and then you add the last 2 and 1, and you get to 3, and then you add the last 2 on, 2 and 3, you get to 5, and so on and so on. And that gets you to the golden mean. If you take the ratio of consecutive numbers, like of 1 and 2, it is 1/2. And if you go way up to 21 divided by 34, then you get to 0.62. And if you get 1,000 numbers further, you still get to 0.62. So it converges there. And that is what we call the golden mean, the relation between 0.62 and 0.38. That's used a lot in paintings. For instance, if you draw a horizon in a painting, you don't draw it in the middle, but you draw it 2/3 up. For us, it's probably good enough if we call it 1/3 to 2/3. The not so thing with the golden spiral is nature doesn't really use that golden spiral much. The golden spiral opens up faster than most natural forms. I didn't know that before. I to draw it and we laid it on our drawing that we have for the level 2 grill, and it opens up way faster than our drawing. and the spiral looks kind of hollow if you make a scroll out of it. So here I show you a different way to draw a spiral. And this would be a general spiral. You can draw any pitch you want with this method. You start with drawing 4 lines here on the first exhibit. They go through a center point and they all have the same angle between them. Since this is 8 beams around, the angle is 45 degrees. Then you put a point, a starting point, on one of the lines. I chose to go 1/2 up on this line, 1/2 inch, but it doesn't really matter. You get the same thing no matter where you start. Then you go and cut a piece of cardboard. I started with cutting it at 80 degrees. So this cardboard was this big, and I marked 80 degrees and I cut it. And then I used that as a ruler. I drew a little line from my starting point at 80 degrees to the next beam that comes from the center. And then I go from here 80 degrees to here, and from here 80 degrees to here, and from here to here, and here back, and I go all the way around until I reach the edge of my piece of paper. So I get as a spiral. Oh no, then I go with a felt pen or some kind of pen and try to make a smooth spiral that goes through all the points where my drawing that I made before crosses the beams that come, or the rays that come from the center. So I get this spiral, and of course I didn't just hit 80 degrees by accident. I tried a couple different angles, and it happens that this 80-degree spiral matches pretty much exactly what we have on the level 2 grill. The inner part matches perfectly, and on the outside, our level 2 is a little tighter than the spiral. Then you can go and do different angles. I just made an example here with 85 degrees, so you get one that opens way faster. And if you would put the golden spiral on the same drawing here that we've seen before, it would be about in the middle in between here, a little more to the outside. But that's all very complicated. It's very easy for the mathematician and an engineer probably. Here's a practical approach that you can use too. You draw your scroll, and I'm not talking about the level 2 grill. I'm talking about if you design a grill. You draw your scroll freehand, and I'm pretty sure that our level 2 grill has been drawn freehand at some point by somebody. When you've drawn it, you see, put a couple lines on it, like I did here, and see what the ratio between these two numbers is. What I have on this scroll that I once did is about 1/2 to 1/2. And I call this the positive space, and this the negative space. You hear a lot of people talking about it, but most don't explain what they mean with it. This is what I mean with it. And it's about 1/2 here and 1/2 here. And the good-looking scrolls are somewhere between 1/2 to 1/2, or the gold mean, which would be 1/3 to 2/3. After you corrected your spiral or your scroll that way, you look if there's any kinks in it and smoothen those out, and then you probably have something that looks pretty good. But here comes the interesting part. If you do the measurement in a different direction, for instance, my blue lines here, you still get 1/2 to 1/2. And you can do on my spiral here, any direction, and you always get 1/2 to 1/2. And that's the nature of the logarithmic spiral. Let's go a little back in history. For centuries, scrolls have been made the same way and even been made using the same tools. I got this picture out of a reprint of an old book that was first published in Paris, 1767. And you see the scroll here, looks pretty much like the one that I had on the last page. And you see scrolling forks like this guy here. It looks pretty much like the one that we teach. And you see a scroll jig here. It looks pretty much like what we teach. So I thought this was pretty amazing when I saw that in this book. And then the other side page, I found this grill here. That's a couple of 100 years old. And I'm not sure if they called that a level 2 grill, but it's awfully close to what we call a level 2 grill. And see this guy here, he's using a scroll jig to make this scroll, and he has the tools, the same that we use. And I think this thing is pretty nice here too. It doesn't have anything to do with scrolls, but it's a nice stand if you work on your anvil alone and can slide up and down here. Let's get to the scrolls that we want to make. I took Russ's 3D pictures here because they show very nicely what the different scrolls that we teach look like. We will start with the ribbon scroll, which is just tapered and stays the same width, and the fishtail scroll that's tapered and gets wider at the end. And we have 2 snub ends. The halfpenny is the easier one. And then the snub end scroll, or sometimes called solid snub end. And at the end, we go into the beveled scroll. Let's start with the first. We taper the end. We trim the width back to constant width. What we use here is 1/4 by 3/8 material. So this is still 3/8, same than here. And we make it to fit our drawing. And then, of course, at some point, we do the other scroll on the other end. So let's get started. I just have a very short version here of how I transfer the drawing and do the measurements. We will have that in more detail by Victoria in the next session. What I do is I take my paper drawing and I tape it to a piece of sheet metal. And then I take my center punch and make little punch marks along all the lines on it. If it's turned tightly, I do a couple more points. If it's just straight, I just use few points. And then I go, before I get started, with some dividers and measure how long my tapers are and how thick the end is supposed to be. We don't need to do this to the last 32nd of an inch. I call this 3.5 here. So the taper is 3.5 long, and it's about 1/16 at the end. For the first 2 scrolls, I don't need many tools. I have my hammer. That's the hammer that I always use. Some think it's too big for these little scrolls, but that's what I'm used to. I have a piece of 1/4 by 3/4. 20 inches for me is a good length so that I don't burn my fingers, and I can avoid using tongs, which makes things easier. And since we haven't made the scrolling fork yet, I made this little U-shaped piece as a bending fork, and I clamped that in my vise. Here are the steps of the ribbon scroll. I taper the end to about 3 to 4 inches with a 1/16 tip. I start that on the horn because it's much faster. You have to be careful to not go too far, then you might have thin spots. And then you straighten it out on the face of the anvil. You start scrolling it, and I do it over a rounded edge on my anvil. Actually, my anvil has rounded edges everywhere. On this spot, it's a little tighter, and here's a little rounder, but nothing is sharp on my anvil. And you do that with kind of brushing strokes. We will see that in the video. And then once it's turned about 90 degrees or a little more, I turn it around and then hammer from the back. And finally, I go with my bending fork, bend it that way until I have the shape that I want. Let's play a little video on that. First, I put the width down a little bit, because if I don't do that, it's getting too wide. And if it's getting too wide and too thin, then it starts folding into itself. So it's easier to first trim that down a little bit and then go do the taper. If you do it the first time, then it probably takes you a couple heats. If you're at your 20th taper, then you probably do it in one. What I show here is in two. I did the ref size in one heat, and then I cleaned it nicely after the second heat and plenished the surface a little bit. If the heat is very low, you don't get new scale, and you get nice clean surface. Here is the brushing strokes. Don't hit it hard. You don't want to indent the corner of the anvil into your stock. Yeah, you somehow have to imprint the shape that you want into your brain, that you don't have to go to the piece of sheet metal where your drawing is all the time. So I've got the start here, and I will leave this at this point. For the other scrolls, I will show you how we go all the way around. Here's some examples of ribbon scrolls that actually were along the way I had to walk to school in the little town in northern Germany where I grew up. When I went to grade school there, I passed by all these fences with not very nicely made, but scrolls and handmade. It wasn't a super rich neighborhood, so this is what they could afford. And I got that imprinted into my brain, so I still love scrolls. This actually came out of the door of the school where I went to. I went back there a couple of years ago and took these pictures. Here is the first ribbon scroll, and what I did on my drawing, and this is a point that we will strengthen in the next session, is I made a mark here in the middle and used that as a reference point. And I measured my stock that I started with and then put it on here. That way I could calculate how much stock it would take to make this scroll. In my case, it was 16 5/8 of the parent stock. So when I go and then do the other end the same way, I know I need to cut this at 16 5/8 from this point to the end. And then if I do the same scroll on the other end, then it will fit my frame. Hopefully it will. So for now, I will use this piece that I just made as a master to make a scroll jig. If you make a lot of scrolls the same way, you can speed up the process by having a scroll jig, because the hand scrolling of larger scrolls takes a lot of time if you all make them freehand, even if you are used to do it. If it's just a little scroll, you can just eyeball it and get it very close. But if it's bent around like what we are doing here, it's very hard. And the scroll jig can either be made, and that's what I will show here, from thicker material. This is 3/8 by 1 and I think 3/8 by 1 I used. Or you can use quarter material, but then you have to weld it to a surface, otherwise it will not hold up. I enlarged this picture from this old book here. They used this version, but they for sure couldn't have welded it. So I'm not sure how they made this. It looks almost like there's a rivet in here and a rivet in the middle, but I do not know that for sure. And the text is very, very hard to read. It's kind of like an old style of German, and I speak German, but it's very hard. So I don't know how they made it. One thing to show here, this end is flared. It's wider. And that's because it's curled around more than 360 degrees. And if this would not be flared, you couldn't get the scroll started. All right, how do we do this? We draw out the end of the bar, make it wider, and offset it to one side. You see the upper line here is straight, and this is not. Then we curl it around, and we continue using a bending fork to do that. And we don't need to be very careful to do that. We just have an approximate shape of what we will end up with. And we use our master scroll, the ribbon that we had made before, and finish it like that. I show you how that works. Here is what we will have at the end. And to not bore you with my hammering here, I speeded this up by a factor of 2. So I get this wider in the front. And what I do is I start in the middle and then go back and forth. And I made a little mark here how wide I want to be at the end. And I do some more with the second heat. I flared it out to about 1.5. And then I thin the end a little bit. And then make it one-sided. There we are. Same that we saw before, just a little faster. We scroll it around over the edge. We make it about to fit. Yeah. So we go little, curl it in a little more, go a little more, then go with the bending fork. And just roughly give it a shape that is a little too small for what we want to do at the end. So see if this fits in there. Yeah, it does fit in there. That's all we need. The fit is very loose, but this is all we need. Now we take a good heat, make it very hot, and put our master in the vise, our loose fit into it, and then now we just hammer it into it, and you see how it goes around and fits pretty nicely into it. When I first did this thing, I was really amazed how easy this was. I got a little gap here. Now I use the fork that I don't have even yet because Russ hasn't made it. And tighten it a little bit there, and that's it. one more scroll, and then I hand over to Russ. The fishtail scroll. The fishtail scroll, the one that's like the one before, but it's tapered and wider. And I don't have to explain a lot because it's pretty much exactly the same than what we had with the ribbon scroll. So I just show you the video of how it's done. Okay, same thing again and again. Do it a little faster to not bore you. We widen this, and on the drawing it was about 1.25 inches wide, so it's not really much I have to do. Yeah, I'm already over it. Then clean it nicely and flatten it on the face of the anvil. Straighten the sides. Okay. Do some more cleaning here before I scroll it. And then I go over, I do the start freehand. I always do the start freehand. And then I use my scroll jig next. About this far. Here's my scroll jig. I use a pair of tongs to hold it. And then just turn it around my jig. And it just takes me 2 heats, as you can see here. It's hot again, and I cooled off the end that I don't open that. And now it hooks in here. I don't need my tongs anymore. I turn it all the way around. Oh no, I didn't make it in 2 heats, sorry. It would be 3 heats, but sometimes if you heat it too long, it's hard to get a good fit. So it's better to go a little slower, and then you don't need to hammer much. You just turn it around and you're done. Here we are, scroll number 2. Show you a couple of fishtails. Here's one that is kind of crude, just thinned out and scrawled, although it's forge-welded here, so it's not that crude. And here's a fancy one that's really flared out wide and even split. And here's one that I once had to replicate. The spreading is done not with a pin of a hammer, but by fullering lines into it and then curling it around. Here's a super fancy one. You see the fishtails down here and in here. Now it's time for questions and then for Russ. Thank you. I just read the first question here and I start to answer as good as I can, and then whoever is on board here of the instructors can jump in and do some more or correct me. Any guidance on the diameter of the forks and the distance between them? No, what I used in the picture was a 3/8 bar, and I had a distance of about 1/2 inch in between, but I have a whole drawer full of these, and for different applications I use different ones. Since they're easy to make, it's not really a big deal. If you have wider curves that you want to do, then you want to have a wider fork. If you have thicker material, then you need thicker tines, otherwise you bend them. I usually just make them out of mild steel and they last forever. So that's all I can say to that. I have series of 1/2. Yeah, that's basically what I just said. Why do I answer here? Oh no, that's Victoria. Sorry. Sorry, Victoria.
Sorry, I weighed in on that one, but it looks like they're asking about the diameter of the tines.
Yeah.
And I didn't really have an answer for that part. I don't know.
I mean, it depends on the, for me, it depends on the thickness of the stock. If I have to bend 3/4 material, then I can't use tines that are 1/4 thick, and I just bend them around, even though they are cold. So that's the answer to that. For what we are doing here today and for the grill, a 3/8 probably is a good size for the tines, and I think that's what Russ has on his more fancy scrolling fork too. About. Then I lean back a little bit and listen to Russ. And if something comes to your mind later on, just put it in the chat line.
Okay, so I'm Russ Evertz, teaching World of Scrolls. Now we'll get started here. So, so the same as what Frank was saying, these are called scrolling forks, bending forks, scrolling wrench, dog wrench. They have lots of different names, but that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to get fancier than what Frank was with his U-shape. He was gracious and only showed his a few times. So the features that we need on a scrolling fork are that we need it to have smooth jaws. That's just so that we don't mark the face of our work when we are scrolling. We can choose whether we want to have tapered jaws that we can get into tighter spaces, and those will work better for organic shapes. And when I'm saying tapered jaws, I mean the width of the tines as well, like a scrolling tongs. So that way you can make the tines real close if you want to bend the stem of a leaf or something. And then for regular scroll work with square stock or rectangular stock, we want to have parallel jaws. So that way we can keep this in one plane, since most of the work that we're doing is in one plane. This picture kind of shows a lot of times it might be easier to leave both scrolling wrenches with the tines pointed up so you can see what you're doing better. I didn't know that before, and that was a tidbit I had seen from somebody in a demonstration. So you can keep that in mind. You can see what's going on better, and so that way you know whether you're moving in or out of plane. The high level steps are, we need to forge the front tine, the one on the end here. Then we need to isolate the second tine, reduce our handle so we have room, and then we upset the second tine. Then we can bend our first end tine there and then square up the jaws, and that's basically it for the business end. So this is everybody's favorite part, is the calculations in blacksmithing. I know you guys all want a blacksmith so that you can do math, and then the fire is just the added benefit. So you can either phone a friend, call an engineer, but I'm oftentimes busy. You can do the math, or Victoria did this last month a little bit when she was working on the poker. So I changed mine, and instead of redoing what she taught, I'm just switching to this block method, which is just to visualize how this could be made up of a predictable size of blocks. So that's the method I'm going to use. It might work better for some people to visualize this than doing the math. And once you sort of see something one way, it's hard to get it out of your head. So then you just start seeing everything as a collection of cubes instead of actually for what it is. So The scrolling fork dimensions, we're going to be using 3/8 stock that starts out as 1 inch thick. And then we're shooting for a 1 inch tine length. And for this demonstration, I'm doing a 1/2 inch, which was probably a bad choice retrospectively because it's a little tricky to get that bend real tight. I should have picked an easier one, but that's comes into the question Victoria answered, which maybe if you have a 1/2 or 3/4 or 1 inch, or maybe 1 1/4 inch, that's that jaw width that we're talking about. And then if you can keep the body about a 1/2 inch thick, then you'll have enough strength to keep your fork from bending while you're bending your scroll. So that's this is kind of the target dimensions. So this method to break it up into blocks, you're basically just shooting for 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch blocks, since that's what the dimension our stock is here, and we have a 1/2 inch gap. So we end up with all of these little blocks. I just call this one a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch block for simplicity. And we're all of the scrolling fork is going to stay at 3/8 of an inch. So we're not going to worry about the volumetric dimensions. We're just going to worry about the 2-dimensional because everything else is going to stay at that 3/8. So we don't have to do anything to address that. So the first thing, if we want to reduce this tine down into a square shape, we can just rotate this tip down, and that gives us a perfect 1/2 inch block, which we've talked about it several times before, and a lot of blacksmiths probably know the height of our triangle is actually 1/2 of the height of the triangle. So that is where we get this height of a 1/2 once we're done. So we started at 1 inch and then we condense it into a block and we get that 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. And then we're going to need to know how to forge this before we put all of that taper. So we need to first have 1.5 inches long by a 1/2 inch high chunk of metal there in order to make our tine and get our bend and get our jaw. So first we have our jaw, we have our bend material, and then we have our tine material. So hopefully this isn't confusing people. And if it is, then you'll just have to look back at last month's and use Victoria's method to the new dimensions. So the second thing we need to do is we need to figure out if we want to make a 1/2 inch by 1.5 inch block of material isolated for that jaw and tine, what do we need to do to get that into the parent stock size? So our parent stock is 1 inch wide. So here we're 1/2 inch wide. So to change that into, condense it back into 1 inch wide, we just cut that in half and stack it up. So we had 1.5 inches here, and now we just move that. So we have 3/4 here and 3/4 here. So we end up with 1 inch high by 3/4 stock. So that's what we're going to have to forge down in order to get this rectangular portion here, and then later our tapered tine. So just kind of as a reminder what we were shooting for, we were shooting for a 1/2 inch jaw. And in order to get that 1/2 inch jaw, we're going to use 3/4 by 1 inch. If you'll remember last month, that every time we go to do a half face blow on our anvil, we end up having our metal creep along. I guess we're doing the near side, so it'll actually start climbing towards us. So we start with something and we want to end up with 3/4. So if we start with 1/8 inch bigger at 7/8, then as that stock creeps back, by the time we're done, we'll end with that 3/4 that we're looking for. So we're going to add an 1/8 inch to that. And that is what we're going to mark our anvil. You saw Frank marking his anvil. Here, I'm going to mark it as well. A lot of times if we mark our steel, by the time we get it bright orange and get it out of the forge, we can't see that mark very well. So if you can, it's easier to mark your anvil, and you can use that as a reference point to start that half face blow. That's why we do the 7/8, even though we calculated it at 3/4. So here's where we're gonna mark it. We're gonna start low when we do our first blow, so that way we can set this shoulder. If you don't have this set low, when you set that first shoulder, you don't end up with a sharp point because you don't have the concentrated blow of your anvil corner, and it'll be harder to hold that firm. So as we're forging it, we're going to be pushing this into the anvil the whole time, and that's going to keep this corner static in the same spot. This shoulder here has that 1/8 of an inch that we talked about. So now we just keep that. You can see every once in a while it bounces out of that step, and now I'm lifting my metal up. And there I was forging that corner back into the piece so that it doesn't get those fish lips that get over the top. And then as you go, you can address that growth in width. But as you're going along, you'll end up with some growth here. It'll mushroom out to the side. So you need to make sure that you address that as you go. If you let it go too long, you can fold this corner over inside and end up with a cold shut. So make sure you address that as you're moving along. So once we get that 1.5 inches, then we're going to go ahead and taper the end of the fork. We want about a 1 inch taper here, and we want our total length to be 2 inches. This is where we need that anvil block to protect our anvil, because our hammer is going to hit our face if we do that. Or you can also use the hardy, especially if you have a square corner of your hammer that you can drop into your hardy, or you can do it over the horn, which is, at the beginning, my block was too wide even, so I had to switch to the horn. So then we're going to isolate that second time. And I think at the beginning, before I had done this and I had seen other people do it, maybe not in real time, I thought this seemed like a crazy idea, but it ends up going a lot quicker than what you might think. So we're going to use this material right here to make that other tine. So if you remember back to that block visualization, we needed a 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch block, and we can tip this up and we'll end up with our 1/2 inch tine. So that says that we only need a 1/2 inch of material. Unfortunately, the math is not really right. I don't know why it doesn't work. There's some material that goes into this radius here and some material that goes into this radius here, but we end up needing a lot more material there. So if anybody knows why the math doesn't work on this, you can type the answer into the chat and I'll share it with everyone. So this is a reason why you also need to do test pieces, just to make sure that what you're doing is actually grounded in reality. Once again, we want to have about 1 inch of material here, but that's going to creep out 1/8 of an inch. So we're going to use 1 1/8 inches to account for that. Same steep first blow as well. And this time I'm actually pulling against that step so that I can keep that corner crisp. And then addressing the width. Now that time I was cleaning up those corners to try to combat those corners flaring out before it even started. So if you need to make a little bit more room, we don't need to reduce our entire handle just yet. We're just trying to get room to have to make room for our fuller. So you can also use the horn of your anvil here, and that'll speed up that handle reduction. So before you move on to your next heat too, since this thing is getting so bowed, you want to make sure you get that kind of straight. So when you come out of the forge hot, you're working with straight stock. That's generally almost always the case. If you go into the forge with straight stock, that way you can be more efficient when you're at your hottest. And generally it doesn't take much to straighten stock because we're not forging the section down. This is probably the most iconic part of the scrolling fork and the skill that's probably the best learned with this tool, and that's upsetting this tine. You can either use an angle or just weld a piece of flat bar here, and then you need to have this radius. You can't tell, this is I think radius a little bit more than what it's showing right here, but you don't want to get a cold shut right there because you have a sharp edge, which is what your vise may be giving you. And your vise is also going to be typically less than 90 degrees. So you might have that angle might be getting too sharp. As we move, oh, this says punch, but it's actually supposed to be your fuller. So as you're driving that fuller in there, you want to stay closer to vertical than 45 degrees. And this is where I never made a handled tool for this, but this is probably a good spot for a handled tool because your knuckles will get a little toasty. You can tell this is my portable anvil instead of my one on my bench. And now I'm fullering those corners in as I go so that they don't get out of control and end up folding over later. So I would say I might be at about 22 degrees or something, halfway between 45. And then you can also switch to your cross peen and your flat face as soon as you start getting down here. And you can see why we want to have that narrow portion of the handle so that we have clearance for that fuller. Now I'm just taking care of those corners so that they're not sticking out. So here's where we're at. We end up getting our tine forged out. And this is the best time to radius these faces. So you remember this contact point right here is going to be hitting the faces of our scrolls. So we want to make sure we get this radiused as well. And then also down in the crotch of this jaw here, that's going to be touching the outer edge of our scroll material too. So we want to kind of radius that and soften all these edges. By the time you get this bent to a 1/2 inch, you can't hardly fit a file in there at an angle to radius this. So it's a lot easier now when you can hot rasp it. We're going to move on to our next step, which is bending that tine over the horn. We have this sectioned up regions or model so we can really see. This was our jaw region. This was our bend and our tip. So we want to make sure we center this spot right here over the horn. And then we're going to quench our tip so that way we can protect that, because we're going to need to hammer right down on that to tighten that corner up. I think this tine is a little bit too long. It gets shorter as you set it down though. So it ended up being only about 1/8 of an inch too long, which you probably want it to be longer than shorter if you're gonna err on one side or the other. So then once we're done, we can set this jaw down onto whatever stock we're shooting for. So we're shooting for a 1/2 inch. So we're gonna set this down on a piece of 1/2 inch stock in our vise, and that's been dressed a little bit. So these insides are rounded, so that way we don't end up with a sharp transition on the jaws, which could reduce its life later. And then set that down and then push these jaws in so that they're parallel. If those jaws aren't parallel, when you go to bend those around, you're gonna end up kind of corkscrewing your scroll as you go. So that's kind of an important step there. So that's basically what we're shooting for. So this is, you can see this is just a little bit wide there. So it didn't end up being too wide, too long in the end. And you end up crumpling this tip a little bit. So it's nice to not have that coming to a point anyways. So that's the end of the business end of the 1/2 inch jaw. I know you guys were asking about the different sizes. So here's if we're looking at some other sizes of jaws and kind of what that would look like, figuring out what kind of material to forge down, and then what type of length we need that tip to be. So if we had 0 opening, we would end up needing a 1/2 inch of parent stock because we have this 1/2 inch block that's 1 inch wide. If we were to go for a 1 inch width jaw, then we have these 2 blocks right here, 1/2 inch by 1 inch. So that's the additional parent stock that we're going to need. So that adds an additional 1/2 inch of length to our parent stock. So for a 1 inch fork, we're going to need a 1/2 inch for the jaw parent stock and a 1/2 inch for the tip, the fork on the tip. So that's going to be 1 inch total. And then remember, when we mark that out, we're going to mark it at 1 inch and 1/8. So that way we can combat that 1/8 of an inch shift. So if you're only going to look at one slide for this whole presentation, this is probably the best cheat sheet for you to have. So this tells you kind of the sizes. So for half inch, we're going to need 3/4 inch stock. So we're going to mark that at 7/8. And then we're going to forge the rectangular portion that's 3/8 by 1/2 inch out to 1.5 inches. And then additionally, we'll forge that to a point. So these are the square ends that we're going to do. So 1 3/4 for 3/4 inch, 2 inch for 1 inch, and 2 1/4 for 1 1/4 inch. So then, just so we can get more math into it, I have this quick slide to talk about the handle. So if we wanted to put a handle, one of the sort of the Abana requirements, one of the things says technically that you should have a scrolling fork with a round handled end with a fixed diameter. So this is kind of how to meet that requirement. So we can pick the diameter. We're going to pick 3/4 of an inch inside diameter, and we're going to make this loop out of 1/4 inch round stock. Once again, review from last month, the neutral axis is the portion of any structure, beam, or member that does not have any tension or compression. So the length doesn't change. So this outside part will be stretching, this inside part will be compressing, but this dotted line here is going to stay the same. And that's for a circle that's in the middle of it. When you start getting into other crazy sections, it moves around. But that's going to be 1/8 of an inch here, plus 1/8 of an inch here, and 3/4 of an inch. So that gives us a total of 1 inch. It's basically your stock diameter plus your inside diameter. So In order to find that circumference, we'll use pi times the diameter. So that's 3.14 times 1. So that gives us 3.14, which I've done this thousands of times, and I still think that sounds crazy that you'd need 3 inches to make a loop like that. But we are going to subtract a little bit because we already have some material here, so we don't need to make that portion of the circle. So we're going to call this 3 1/8, which is 0.125. So if we subtract that, then we get about 2 3/4 is what we need for our stock length. So we go ahead and forge that down to 2 3/4 with 1/4 inch diameter. We're going to bend this into a hockey stick first, not quite 90, a little bit open, but that, while we can get in here, you can't do this very well later after you've started your loop. So we'll do that first. After we do this step, then we're going to bend the tip later or secondarily. And finally, in the end, we're going to bend the middle. So that'll get us to our turned eye, and that will be 3/4 of an inch ID. And then if you want to case harden your scrolling fork, I don't know that case hardening is that helpful on scrolling forks, but it is helpful, especially on bottom tools and other things. It basically just puts a shell around your mild steel that has a higher carbon content. So it'd be like sort of like the eggshell around a boiled egg. You know, instead of just being soft and mushy mild steel, you'll have this stiffer shell, and it's supported by the mild steel underneath. So to do that, you heat your stock up to 1600, and then this is a powder that contains carbon and a bunch of other things. And then you reheat that up to red again and quench it in water quickly. And that will harden up the surface. And you can actually get a scale to skate on mild steel by doing that. So when you're done, don't forget, especially that's kind of another feature of the Banner program is to try to get people to have a nice fit and finish on all of their stuff, which means trying to remove all of your loose scale and then apply some sort of finish. If you're handing this over to somebody that's going to be judging your work and seeing how you're going to do, it's nice to go the extra mile to have a finish on it, which is the same thing when you're handing anything over to the public or to one of your clients. It's nice to have a finish and to get that scale off of there just to raise the bar for all blacksmiths. I think that's about it for my portion. I wasn't watching to see if there are any comments.
Yeah,
Any
we
questions?
can probably ask Otto to explain why your math didn't work. He put that in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that'd be good.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yep.
No, this is just a thought, and I can't 100% prove it, but the way that you hold the piece in the vise is very similar to the way you do a half face blow. So you're going to get some material creep as you try and upset that second tine. And the front tine usually grows in length a little bit, which I think yours came out an 1/8 inch longer. It's probably
Right.
where that material came from. It's because it's shifting down in the vise just a little bit.
Yeah, pushing everything up. So you're actually forging on the anvil side, which is your vice jaw,
Yeah.
like your
You-
hammer side. Yeah, that could be. You're just actually pushing that whole thing up. Sure.
So you'd lose a little material there, and then to the radiuses, and then because you're not coming to like an infinite point, the math,
Right.
it's an 1/8 inch here, a 16th inch there, and it starts to add up pretty quickly, especially if you're not using any dies or anything to make sure that you're going back exactly to the parent thickness.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it just doesn't look good when you're saying you need a 1/2 inch and I'm telling people to lay off 1 inch and 1/8.
Right.
Listen to the math here and ignore it over here.
Yeah, there was a question. You had this table of different lengths, and the question was, is that all for 3/8 material?
So the material does not matter. Because we don't use the thickness of the material to calculate what we're doing on this 2D face of the metal. So it could be any thickness. The part that does matter is that this height has to be a 1/2 inch. So that's the critical one. So the jaw spacing and then your handle height is a 1/2. So, but the 3/8 thickness does not matter. It can be 3/8 or 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch even, as long as you have a 1/2 inch of height. So.
And there was another question, substitute for caseinite.
Oh, that would be cherry red is probably the most popular, and there's another one that's a new one as well, because caseinite is out of production. My neighbor gave me that can. I don't remember what the other one is called, but cherry red is one that they make now. But there's a couple, one or two other ones.
Yeah, there is another question in the same line, case hardening versus super quench. I don't know if you know something about that.
I personally almost never case harden anything that's mild steel, and I do use super quench quite a bit because I think it's because it's 4 times faster and it doesn't cost as much. And it does make the same, it just has a super rapid cooling effect when you use super quench. I don't know if people know what super quench is. It's salt dishwashing detergent and like a jet dry surfactant. So all of those things raise the boiling point where it touches the metal, and then also makes the water stick to the metal more and reduces the steam jacket. So it's basically cooling the metal quicker than what regular water could. So it's kind of like another step further when you go from oil to water to super quench is another quick. So it's typically used for mild steel. It's developed from, I think, Rod Guntner out of New Mexico. He was a mechanical engineer at Los Alamos.
Here's another quenching question. Is it getting brittle by doing the super quench or any of that?
I don't think the whole steel will get brittle because there's not enough carbon in mild steel to do that, unless by chance you happen to get a piece of mild steel that's on the way far end of the spectrum. But if you put some other stuff in super quench, you could really be into some problems, which probably get into a dangerous situation. But for mild steel, I don't think the hardness doesn't go deep enough for it to become brittle with mild steel. But I would not be putting any junkyard steel in super quench and then be using it, because you could be shooting torpedo projectiles. Oh, the steps of the turn die. I turned off my sharing, so now I can see. I couldn't see the questions when I had the sharing on. So to make that turn die, first you do it in a hockey stick angle. I guess it's not quite a 90-degree angle. You're about maybe 20 degrees off 90 degrees. So you do that first. After you do that, then you turn your piece over and you bend the tip. So you have the bend here and then the bend in the tip. And then once you're done with that, you just close the middle. It's really hard to get into the tip. Once you have that thing curled around there, it's hard to get in there and knock that tip around. So that's kind of a handy trick whenever you're doing turn dies, is to do the root bend first. And usually you need the most heat to do that root bend. So. All righty. Well, I guess back to you,
Very
Frank.
good. All right. We come to the half penny scroll now. It has a solid end, round end, that is reduced in width. And that's because we get that snub mass created out of the flat side of the bar and then twist it 90 degrees. And this is actually the easiest way to make a larger snub. I got a progression here before I go into the video and explain the different steps. We start with our bar. We mark off about a square. Since this is, I mark off 3/4. And as we learned before, you can either mark that on your bar, or you make a bar on the end, make a mark on your anvil, and then you can visualize the 3/8 and then push it 3/8 over the far edge and make your indentation there and create the step. And then taper that back. We're going again about 3 inches plus the snub that gives about our 3 to 4 inches. That's what I did here. That's good enough. We forged that neck down, not all the way to 1/4. That's what we will end up with, but we just go to 3/8 here, which is about the half of the original width. And we twist it around 90 degrees and we clean up the twist and then start rounding the end. When we clean up the twist, we forge it further down. So if we would have necked it in 1/4, we couldn't clean up the twist anymore. And that's the reason we don't go all the way to 1/4. I show you here just to get off the upper right corner of the square end and the lower left corner. And then we end up with kind of a teardrop. Next step then is to hit, like I've shown here with my little arrows, from the side and from the top side, and start curling in at the same time and round the penny that way. And from there, I go over the far edge and curl this in slowly, exactly the same way that I did before. Some people like to use a scroll jig like shown in the bottom here. I made one at some point, but I actually then after that never used it. This is over the far edge and then correcting as you go. For me personally is a much easier way to do it and quicker. After you got the first curl in here, you turn it over, put it on the flat face of the anvil, hit from the back side, hit to the top. I made me a little sheet here that was just for the video, because then I didn't need to go back and forth between my anvil and the table. I could show how I go closer and closer to what I finally want to achieve. And I have another little scroll jig here that fits my hardy hole that I used, and that was for video purposes too. I usually don't do this on the anvil. If I do it for myself, then I clamp this little bending jig in my vise and work there. How does this work? Again, a little video. Okay, I go to the far end of the anvil. I make my indentation, and as we've seen before, you don't start laying the piece flat on the anvil, hold it up a little bit to have that corner bite in there. And of course, it's a very rounded corner that it doesn't bite too much, that you don't get a cold shut there. Because when you curl in your end, that cold shut can't be corrected anymore. You just have to start over again. This was my first heat on it. And I took a second one to get a little deeper. It wasn't quite where I wanted it. Get the thickness back to constant thickness all over. Then I start beveling the edges a little bit, just because in the final piece it looks better. And this is the best way to do it at this stage. Later on, after you curled it in, it's not that easy. And here's another version of a bending fork that I use a lot. It's just a 3/8, no, it's a half inch round bar from 4140 that I just bent this way. That's easy to make. Clean up the twist of 4 sides. Do a little more tapering, a little more edge cleanup. And then you start rounding your piece. The outside corner. One thing you need to make sure here, it starts to fish lip. This is just a quarter thick, and if you hit it too hard, you get fish lips in a way that you can't reef anymore. So don't hit it too hard. There I had some fish lips that I'm trying to clean out here. Yeah, you really can see it there. That's my teardrop shape. Probably needs a little bit more refinement. You still see the thick edges, so I clean those out a little more. A little more rounding. Now I'm ready to get the teardrop forged to round. When you do the first one, you want to go pretty slow to not mesh it up. And then if you do the second and the third, it's getting kind of automatic and it's getting faster too. Here it is round. Now I have my drawing there. I got a little kink there. That's very easy to get. And you need to get that out before you go any further. It's important that the curve of the beginning is exactly right before you go and curl it further, because you will never get there anymore. Here's my brushing strokes again. There was another little kink. And there's 1,000 ways where you can position, how you can position the piece on the anvil to get the kinks out and get more curve somewhere or got less curve. It's just a matter of doing it more often, and then it's kind of getting automatic. I go into some of these later on in the presentation. Here we go, a little more. Put it on there. You see my penny is a little bigger than what's on the drawing, but for the level 2 exercise, it doesn't really matter. It's just if you put 2 of the same kind into your grill, they should be the same, not one small and one big. If I wouldn't have gone with, see there, get a kink out there. I have this little shelf on my anvil. That's very handy for that. But you can also do it on the horn. I show you later. So bend a little more. And you go on and on. If you do that freehand. If you do many of them, you will build a jig. You build a jig in a way that you can hook the penny on the end of the jig, and then it's really very quick to do the whole bend. A little more, and always make sure that the middle is perfect before you go on, because it's much harder to correct on the inside than it is correct to correct the outside. And I leave it there. I don't want to bore you to go all the way around. And we try the next one, the snub and scroll. That's really a classic, and I will show you a number of pictures of it after we made one. The snub end here, or the mass for the snub end, can be created in different ways. You can fold the end over and do a faggot weld. You can do a ribbon scroll and curl it up very tightly and then weld that ribbon together, or you could upset the end. And the last one is the one that I will show you here. Again, a progression. This time we do our indentation the other way around on the flat side. And since we just have a quarter here, we need to be very careful that we don't go too deep here. Then we probably kink it or even break the whole thing apart. I figured here that 1/2 inch of material isolated at the end gives a nice scroll, and it's not too long that it will fold or do any bad thing when you try to upset it. If you go further than 2 times the thickness and upset, then you need to have very careful blows that you upset it in itself and don't curve it. What you see in the bottom here is I got a little curve on this picture already. This is still correctable, but if it mushrooms more here, then you have to start over again. Let's get back to the steps. Mark off about 2 times the thickness. That would be 1/2 here. Create a step with half-face blows on the far side, about to 1/2 of the thickness. If in doubt, do a little more than 1/2, especially if the stock is that thin. Then you turn it around to the backside, away from the thin spot. You lay it flat on the anvil. You have an angle here that is less than 90 degrees. This is probably a little too much already. And you upset it with straight blows, straight down on it until it's about square here. While you do this, you trim back the width to have it all the way the same width than the parent stock, which was 3/4. From the square, you do the same set of steps that we did before for the 1/2 penny. You create a teardrop, and it's a tiny teardrop. It always looks flat. And from there you go around, and then you start curling it in. You see here is still a kink. So next step for this would be get this kink out and then go further and then go even further. And in between, check on your drawing if you are still where you should be. Some pictures for making the round. You have the square. You start with this corner. Then you take the inside corner by turning it around, this guy here. This is a little tricky because this is pretty small here, and I used a pretty big hammer. So it might be advisable to use a smaller hammer to get in here good enough to not have this mushroom over to the inside. And then you go and round the teardrop. and then work it from the other side, check progress, and go on with a bending fork. Sometimes it's useful to have two bending forks. Sometimes it works just with your free hand at the end. And we see that done in a little video. When you do this indentation, be careful to not do a double step. I'm very close to doing a double step here. It tries to walk toward you as you feel the edge of the anvil, and if you hit it in the wrong time interval, then you smash it, and then you have to start all over again. You see, I'm a little sideways here, a little out of 90 degrees, but you can still correct that if you see it. Just hold the end a little bit to one side or the other side, and you can still straighten this out. No, I bent. Yeah, there was still a little bit to do. It was a little too wide. I got this indentation cleaned up a little bit. There we are. Okay. This is how it looks. Push it over to the backside. Turn it over. This was too close to 90 degrees. And hit it down until it's about square. This is actually much easier if you do that with 1/2-inch stock. Here we are. Work the outside corner until that's kind of round, then go to the inside corner. You see, I start from the inside and then work myself away. That's to counteract my little fish lips that I have there. And then I go outside and get the whole thing round. It takes less hammer blows with this way than on the penny, because it's less material to move. Of course, it's a much smaller snub. Then brushing blows to get it rounded. Get the inside a little tighter. Go a little further. There we are. That's pretty much exactly fitting the grill to about here. And then I go to my scrolling forks and finish it. I make a little excursus here. How do I correct mistakes? I just have a couple of common mistakes or common situations here. Often as you go, you're already a couple of inches into the scroll, and then you see, oh, my tip is not right. It needs to be either tightened or widened. Usually it's tightened. I told you I have this little shelf here that I can use, but not all anvils have a shelf. You can do the same thing on the horn of the anvil. Put the tip on it and hit it from above or from here to just curl this in a little more. That's a common thing that I, by now, it's just automatic. I didn't even think about it. Another common thing to happen is you get a kink somewhere. You're trying to do a bend here, but it's not hot enough on the end, and then it kinks where just it's hot enough. And that needs to be corrected before you get any further. Otherwise, you you lose control. And the easiest way to get this kink out is to use your scrolling fork, hold your piece with a bend, and I best is to mark it here, then you know exactly what it is. In the middle on the side of the scrolling forks, and just very little tips from the side will go a long ways to make this smooth and straight again. If you have kind of a complex deviations, or you're very close to the final shape, what I often do is I heat up a wide section and I put my piece on my sheet metal with my drawing, and then use 2 scrolling forks. And you see that here. And what I actually created here is I bent it too much, as you see. So this needs to go back to here, probably to a wider tined fork to get this straightened, or you bend it to the outside again. This guy here, sometimes I have a hard time positioning this and exactly where the end of the scroll needs to be while working on the end piece. And to do this to size, the position of the end is very important. And it seems much easier if put this piece on my sheet metal and then work with 2 scrolling forks. And so I can see the whole thing and how it moves. Now some examples. Here's some snub end scrolls made of 1/2 by 1. Here's something very elaborate out of thin material, snub ends. Here's an old piece that I found on an old railing, and it looks almost like this was forged from a ribbon. Here you see it on this one here, from a ribbon that was curled tight and then somehow forge welded together. Another example here that's a little more modern, but probably also 100 years old. And here one that is, it's somehow 2 ends forged into 1 scroll. So it comes in all kinds of ways, and you find it all over old and new blacksmith work. We have one last scroll to do, and that's the more difficult to do because this is kind of a 2-dimensional scroll. It's scrolled in 2 dimensions, twisted and scrolled at the same time. The end is tapered. It has a ridge here in the middle, and it's scrolled and twisted 90 degrees at the same time. So you get a scroll that's looking bigger. It's almost like the halfpenny scroll, but this time the twist is not at one point. It is over a length of maybe 2 inches or something. The exact dimensions are easy to see on the drawing that Russ has provided. I show you the steps again here, and then the video how it's done. You start with the same straight piece. You do a 1-sided taper here. That's kind of like a short taper. I think this was about 2 inches from here. Don't nail me down on that. I just don't have the number on my head right now. Anyway, you do this taper. Then you bend this over to the straight side. show this here, and I did a couple tests, and I got to, this needs to be bent over about a 3/4 of a total bend, so it's 270 degrees. Then you start beveling the inside with a rounded hammer. I have 2 rounding hammers, and I use the smaller one for this. And as you can see here, while you do that, it opens up a little bit. But then you turn to the outside, and it curls in again. And you work this inside outside until you work out a nice clean ridge in the middle here. And then you twist this and scroll it at the same time to get about this shape here. Show you how that's done. No, there's one more picture here, a little more detail. Let's go over it again. Create a one-sided taper, curl in over the straight side. This might need a couple trials. It took me 2. The first time I didn't curl it enough. And then after I was done, the whole thing was too wide to fit the drawing. So the next one I curled in more. This is this is straight. This is 90 degrees. This is 180. This is 270. And that worked for me. Then you bevel the inside. Then you bevel the outside. I usually don't go all the way when I do the inside. And then I do one times around and just slightly, don't go all the way. And then I go inside, outside until I got my ridge exactly where I want it. You can take your time with it. It doesn't really matter if it takes a little longer. Then the compound bend is really hard to explain, but it's pretty easy to see on the video how it's done. And then it's again hard to really do. The beveled scroll on the level 3 grill actually is easier to do than this one, I have the feeling, because it's a little bigger and the compound bend is easier to do. If you're not able to do the compound bend over the horn of the anvil in one go, that is not really a big deal. You can always correct what you did with bending forks. And that way you have better control. That's at least how I do it. And I show you a little video here, how this is done. This is kind of the final here. Okay, short taper. You really have to start at the very tip, otherwise you don't get it taper that short, and you need to hit it hard, correct, for the width, for the thickness of the stock, sorry. And try to taper in that one dimension and keep the thickness the same everywhere. There we are. That's about the shape you're going for. Then you hit this. I need to work on the base of my anvil. You see that it's moving if I hit it from the side. But it worked. Just took me one heat more because the anvil was giving. Turn it over, curl it in a little more. Now you can go to the flat side. It's moved a little bit out of view here, but I guess you get the idea what I'm doing here. Curl it in. I straighten the lower part back out again. All right, there we are. on the next picture where you see the whole shape. On the reflection, you see it. And what I did here is, once I had my first try and then the second try, I marked it on a piece of let's do this first here. Do the inside, be very careful. Don't need to go all the way, just give it a good beginning. And then when you come to the outside, you give that a beginning, and then you start seeing the ridge in the middle, and you can play with that and move it a little outside, little inside until it's where you want it to be. I realized that it's very easy to hammer scale into these ridges, and it doesn't look very nice. That's why I cleaned it extra nice before I started on the outside. Here you see before you could see a little bit that there were still two lines going around, and you can slowly move those two lines until you just have one left in the middle. I'm going on the outside here. Now you see there, it's nice here. I need to work on the tip, and of course here it's still wide open. Take one more heat, clean it off. Sometimes it's good to wait a little bit until the heat goes out of it a little bit. You're not moving much, so it doesn't really need to be very hot, but you see much better if it's getting into the reds. Yeah, even on the video, you can see where the ridge is. Okay, there we are. Probably nil. Here it needs a little bit. So, and here is how I do the compound bend. Always keep the stock 90 degrees to the horn. My anvil has a pretty thick horn. That's why I made this little extra anvil here with a thinner horn that I clamped in the vise. So this is what I end up with. So it's kind of going in the right direction, but it's not quite where it should be. And then I take my bending forks and do the rest of it. It still needs a little bit more. Some people do this with a mallet, with a rawhide mallet. I never had good luck with that rawhide mallet because it's too light. And if it's so light, then I can't hit it hard enough. So I use a small hammer, and I try to not hit the ridge. I try to hit always either the one side or the other side of the ridge, and then it works better with a hammer. But that's for me. You have to figure out what works best for you. Maybe you're better with a mallet. I know Mark Asprey uses a mallet, but there we are. It's not clean yet, but with that little U-shape or the clamp bending fork, you can still get this in the right shape. And again here, if you're turning where the ridge is, make sure that the edges of your bending fork don't hit on the ridge. Then you get an indentation there and you never get that out again. All right, this was it for today. We got the pieces that fit the drawing, but we don't have them in one piece yet. We don't have the frame yet. We will do that the next time. And one thing else, we're not there yet, even if we have the pieces. The journey has just begun. I just can say have fun exploring your scrolls. Have some more elaborate ones here to see that you're never done if you learn blacksmithing. Thank you. 90-degree twist for what purpose did that serve? Is that the first question, or do I have to go further up? Yeah, that's the first question. The 90-degree twist is to get that big halfpenny in the same plane that you see it from the side when the scroll is done. That's why it's done. If you do the halfpenny using the width of the stock, the 3/4 width, you get a bigger snub than if you do it the other dimension, which is the other scroll that I showed. And that's why the twist is in there. What are your lines on the plate marked with that doesn't burn off from the heat? What I do when I transfer my drawing to the sheet metal is I tape it to the sheet metal, and then I use a center punch and make little marks that I then fill in with a Sharpie or something. And if the Sharpie burns off, which it does, I still have the center punch marks, so I can redo my drawing on the same piece metal, on the same sheet metal without any problem. That's why I do it that way. Sometimes I even use my table for that. I make the center punch marks on my table and then color it either with chalk or Sharpie, and can do several goes with hot metal. And when it burns off, then I just redo the coloring, and that works pretty good for me.
A bevel question: is it easier to bevel before you bend your leaf or your?
I've never tried that. I just did it this way.
Just seems like it would be easier to get that inner curve beveled, or at least started, before you've got the rest of the curl in the way when you bring it around.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you have to hit it pretty hard to curl it in from the sides. You saw my anvil moved on me, which makes kind of ugly marks maybe. But I have to say I've never tried it. Maybe it works, and maybe it works better. I will try it, and I mean, just go experiment, see what works better for you. That inner bevel is pretty hard when you first try to do it, but after a while, it's not hard anymore. What helps is if you have a smaller ball hammer, not really a ball peen, that was just make ugly marks. But if you have something in between, which I have, that's how I got started on these. And then after a while, I got the hang of it, and I could use my regular ball and hammer. But before that, I used a smaller ball. I don't know how that's called.
I would just think, especially on the inside, because when you hammer it
it
around,
is.
you're going to hammer mostly on the outside, and you can clean that back up.
Yeah, the outside is easy to clean up. That's true. The inside you need to get right at the beginning. I agree with you, but you will see if you do it a couple times, then it seems like it's not that difficult anymore, and it tends to open up. So if you
It's going
place
to,
your
yeah.
first blows right, then it's getting easier.
Well,
And
that's
once
part
you
of
have
why.
done-
That's the other reason I was thinking doing some of the bevel first might be easier, because then you're not opening it up, working on the
Mhm,
inside bevel,
mhm.
then having to close it back up. And
Yeah, I mean, try it, see what happens, and tell us next time. And maybe then we change our way of doing these things. I mean, I would assume that whoever did that before us somehow had a reason to do it this way, but maybe that's not true. Okay. Do you never adjust the scroll when it's cold? I do. But not the tight part of the scroll. If you do it cold, it tends to kink. Whatever you do with the scrolling forks cold, it tends to make just a kink at one point instead of going a wide scroll. Where I use cold corrections is if I have to fit the scroll into a frame and it just slightly doesn't fit. I use 2 scrolling tongs, pretty wide ones, that are grabbing the scroll wide apart. And sometimes you can correct half an inch or something that it doesn't fit in the frame that way. But if you're not careful, it might just kink on you, and then you have to make it hot again and get kink out and start over. But sometimes it works pretty good. Not if there is a little mistake to be corrected more on the inner part of the scroll. I never had luck with that. Then I usually ruin it rather than doing any good. Okay.
I think that's about it.
The next session that we have in 4 weeks will be making the frame and fitting our scrolls into that frame and fastening there. So that's the next thing. And the last session then is what's left for the grill. Oh, doing the colors, and not just the colors that we need for the grill, but some more fancy square cornered colors too. And some tools that are missing, like the scrolling tongs, and I actually don't remember what else. Oh yeah, and then I asked Stuart, since we had this long discussion on heat treatment, if he could do a little thing on heat treatment. And if he finds the time, we will have that too to come. All right. That's where we are. You tell me when it's enough.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everybody.